It's Brandon or Bevins from the cEDH Budget Brews channel and Discord. Today we're continuing our budget interaction under $5. This time we're doing 1 mana value cards that are under $5 that we think you should put in your deck to help give it that extra bump that it may need. We're going to go ahead and start with blue, like last time, and we're going to start with Fading Hope, which is, of course, a 1-drop blue. Instant. Return target creature to its owner's hand. If its mana value was 3 or less, scry 1. So this is really good because it's good early game, it's good late game. It bounces to hand depending on what you're targeting, whether that be a Drannith Magistrate or someone's early commander, things like that. You're able to scry 1, so it gives you a little bit of advantage. So that way you can remove their thing and you get to technically dig 1. And that could really help with your next turn. It could really help top deck into something better, things like that. I will say that most of the spells on this list do target, which is one of the biggest downsides. So, well, I say one of the biggest downsides, but only if your opponents are consistently running things that don't allow you to target, such as Shroud or Hexproof, things like that, which I personally feel like isn't really too relevant. But in case you are running against a lot of people that do, it could be more relevant to you. Continuing on, we're going to talk about Pongify and Hybridization, which is, they're pretty much the same card, they just do something slightly different. They destroy target creature, can't be regenerated if controller creates a 3/3. For Pongify, it's an 8 creature token, and for Hybridization, for Rapid Hybridization, it is a green frog lizard creature token. Typically, the fact that you're giving your opponent a 3/3 creature doesn't matter, because typically you want to remove the scary creature, right? Something that's a little bit more intimidating, or something that stops you from playing the game properly, such as Drannith Magistrates or Thrasios, things like that. And I would much rather have my opponent have a 3/3 than have something that shuts me down, or have something that can potentially ruin the game. I think one of the spiciest things that I've done with Pongify specifically was my friend was going to swing at me with his Paco, which was a 24/24, and I turned it into a 3/3, and he was kind of upsetty spaghetti, but it is what it is. That's the nature of the game. So although this doesn't have any target restrictions, which is one of the best parts in my opinion, you can target any creature. It doesn't have to be like in the last video. There's a lot of non-black creatures that you can only target, and like I said, being able to remove things like pretty much any creature as long as you can target it is really good, because I would much rather have them have a 3/3 than their commander or their value engine, which is typically their commander. Continuing on, now let's talk about Mystical Dispute. This is one of the cards that I personally like to run in a lot of my blue decks. It says it's a 3-drop initially, but it says it costs 2 colorless less to cast, or 2 generic less to cast, if it targets a blue spell. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. Any blue spell is the thing. So there's a lot of blue that runs, especially in most odds, in my opinion. You have Arenas, Aminatus, you have Eurekos, Kesses. You could destroy any of them or counter any of them for 1. And I think that's amazing value. I mean, counter it unless they pay 3, but typically if it's their commander, they're tapped out, or they're just about tapped out. And much like Daze, if they pay it, typically they're not going to be able to continue their turn, especially because 3 is kind of a hefty price, especially early game, and there's no way of them to really get around it. So it's either they lose the thing that they're trying to gain value with, or they pay the 3 and keep it, but they can't really do anything else, and they kind of dirtle out for the rest of their turn at least. And then, of course, in order for you to be able to pay it for 1, it has to target a blue spell. So if your pod isn't really running blue, if you're running against, mono green Stompy or Goblin players like me, you're not really going to have a good time with this card, and it might be better to swap it out for something like a more traditional counterspell, things like that. And let's continue on to black. So Deathmark is a sorcery that says the story target green or white creature. This is really good because in a lot of casual metas and lower power metas, you're running into a lot of green. Maybe not so much white, but even then, it does get a lot more representation than in higher level pods, things like that. Example creatures that it could counter. One of my personal favorite creatures to target with this effect is Chulane, or even, Gretchen, things like that. Thrasios is a good example. And all of those are relatively commonly run creatures. And the fact that you could just destroy it at any time on your, whenever you can cast a sorcery, can make it relatively strong. People are running Dranith Magistrates, people are running Selvalas, things like that, Marwins, Azuris, and they're scary. So why not remove them? Of course, the downside being if for some reason, your pod's not running green or white, it's not a good card. In my opinion, it's a super duper slim chance that that's ever going to be a real downside. You know what I mean? Now let's talk about Duress as well as Inquisition of Kozilek. They kind of do very similar things. Target opponent reveals a hand, you choose a non creature card or non land, and that player discards that card. So if your opponent ends up having like Underworld Breach, or if they have Brain Freeze in hand, things like that, something that's really, really important to remove, you can remove it. And that's considering that a lot of, especially in Commander, a lot of decks want to rely on things outside of creatures to win because it's just faster and probably more consistent. It really ups the power of this card, even if you don't really consider it, because every deck is running, or excuse me, most decks are running instants or sorceries. They're running artifacts as well as enchantments, planeswalkers. The fact that this targets everything except for creatures and lands, I mean, you're still able to remove probably like half of their deck or more, and I just think that's really important. Most value engines in the format rely heavily on artifacts, enchantments, planeswalkers, and the fact that you could just remove it at any time, well, not at any time, at sorcery speed, but the fact that you can just remove it from their hand really can really push you forward, as well as if you cast it and they have a counterspell in hand that they didn't use up because they didn't think it was super important. Well, you could potentially protect your win if you're going to try to win that turn, or even your board state, depending on what you remove, like a remove a spell, things like that. So I think that's also really, really important. I would say the hardest part about Duress and Kozilek, or Inquisition of Kozilek, is learning when you want to act or cast this. I typically cast this whenever my opponents have a tutor that they just used. I really want to remove what I think they tutored for, and I really want to keep them from being able to progress their board state. It's a really strong card. I think it's definitely underutilized, and the fact that it's in black and it's kind of like a hand attack could really screw people over, especially in their colors. Depending on the colors they're using, they may not be able to draw a bunch of cards. So if they only have a couple of cards at hand and you remove the thing that's going to progress their board state or progress their hand state, what are they going to do? You know what I mean? Of course, on the other hand, where Kozilek differs from Duress a little bit is that it can target creature cards, just not lands. As long as it's mana value 3 or less. So it depends on what your opponents are running. It depends on their decks. It's very, very dependent on what they're doing. But what makes it good is the fact that it's almost always going to be a good cast, both Duress and Inquisition here. It's almost always you just have to know who to target, when to target, and what to target. Overall, just two really good cards that I think deserve more play. Now let's talk about Fatal Push. I remember when this card was like $13 a pop, and now it's freaking bulk rare, which is awesome in my opinion. I love it when that happens. I love reprints. I love the fact that this card is extremely useful, and I love the fact that it's in black and someone's getting kicked off a tower. It's my favorite art in this whole block. That being said, enough gushing. Let's see what it talks about. Destroy target creature if it has mana value 2 or less. Or destroy that creature if it has mana value 4 or less instead if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield. that there's a little bit to unpack here, right? So left the battlefield. That means if you blink something, you can cast it for its revolt. If you're running fetch lands, you play a fetch land, you fetch with it. A permanent you control. Oh no, creature permanent you control is left the battlefield this turn. So if you have a fetch land, you use it. You can cast it for its revolt. Or if you're running a lot of self-sacrifice stuff like in cEDH or Windgrace, things like that, permanents leaving the battlefield. So very consistently, depending on the deck you're running, you can destroy target creatures with 4 or less. What makes it bad is the fact that the mana value restriction, depending on what your opponents are playing, you can't target Elesh Norns with it, unfortunately. You're not going to be able to target things that are 5 or greater. So if your opponents are running a lot of high mana value creatures, which is typically more common in the lower spectrum of the power level, then it's not going to be as good. But if you're running in like mid to high, there's going to be a lot of creatures you're going to want to target with it. Also, depending on your deck, this may not be as good as it can be. Because it's an instant, if your opponents decide to attack you and you block and something dies, you can cast it then. But if your opponents aren't doing that, or if you're not self-sacrificing, you're going to only be able to target things that are mana value 2 or less. So depending on your deck, depending on your opponents and how they play, it could definitely be a less good card. But then again, there's a reason this card costed a lot of money back in the day. So I definitely think it's a really good card. I definitely think people should run it a little bit more often, especially in black, because black loves self-sacrifice. Black loves destroying things of itself in order to progress its own board state. It's just overall a very quality card. So next we're going to talk about red. Specifically right now we're going to talk about Galvanic Blast and Lightning Bolt, which are 2 very similar cards in my opinion. They're instant 1-drops. Galvanic Blast says deals 2 damage to any target or metalcraft. Deals 4 damage to instead if you control 3 or more artifacts. And Lightning Bolt just says deal 3 damage to any target. What are the ups of these cards? Well, with Galvanic Blast, especially in Commander, you're going to be able to do that 4 damage pretty consistently depending on your deck. So if you're playing something like Godo, or even like running a Dockside Extortionist, or even a Stormcone Artist, you can pretty consistently get this to its 4 to destroy a creature, to end up, closing out the game on an opponent. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure Lightning Bolt and Galvanic Blast can also target Planeswalkers, which is really good. That could really slow down people who are running Planeswalkers. That could really destroy them pretty quickly, especially if they're running more of the or the Spark Planeswalkers. That's very, very important. On top of that, the fact that Galvanic Blast kind of scales with you is really important. Of course, Lightning Bolt only says 3 damage anywhere, and it could potentially be big. It could remove creatures, again, it could remove Planeswalkers, people from the game, depending on how if their life total is low. Now let's talk about my personal favorite red cards. Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast. They do the same thing. You can counter target spell if it's blue, or you can destroy target permanent if it's blue. Downside, it has to target something blue. Upside, there's a lot of blue. Being able to counter something on the stack, keeping your opponents from being able to get that advantage is really important. But if you draw into it on your next turn, you can destroy it. So if they're running something like, what's a good blue creature? Kess. You can potentially counter their Kess, or you can destroy their Kess. I don't know about you, but Kess scares me, and I want to destroy it. So those are really good red cards, especially if you're running mono red. It's a way to interact on the stack, which red is lacking, and it's a way to kind of control the board state without doing direct damage, which is another thing that red kind of lacks. So I think that these 2 cards are super good. Of course, if you're in a pod that has 0 blue for some reason, because they have a personal vendetta against it or whatever it may be, of course, Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast aren't as good. That being said, again, it's It's quite rare for somebody to not run blue. At least one person. There's a lot of Simic commanders. People like big stompy creatures. I don't know about you, but their commander looks really good in that command zone, right? Again, if somebody's not running blue or if nobody's running blue, this card can be useless. So be very mindful of your pod. Be very mindful of the decks you're playing against, your play group. But again, typically there's that Simic player who loves his Tatiova. You hate it, right? Well, your mono red goblins can't keep up with Tatiova. Well, now you can slow her down. Now let's talk about the pristine primo red cards, right? Blast. One drop, sorcery, destroy target artifact you don't control. Or you could pay its overload cost for 5, replacing target artifact with every artifact. So essentially, if you pay its overload cost, it says destroy every artifact you don't control. That's good. Because in early game, you can cast it for 1, spot removing somebody's stuff. Late game, someone played their Dockside Extortionist, they have 37 treasures for some reason. Why don't you get rid of those? As well as the rest of what's making your life miserable at that point. It's really good. It scales with you. It's really fun. Of course, if you're in a pod that hates artifacts for some reason, not as good. But almost every deck, if not every deck I've played against, has at least 3 artifacts. So if your friends or your pod has no artifacts, question what they're doing with their life. It could really cut your friends off. It could really slow them down. And the fact that it scales with you as the game progresses, so it's almost never a dead draw, is really good. And that's something that you want in a card. You want something that is good early game, is good mid game, and good late game. And this card, every time I've cast it, has won me a game. And of course, it only destroys artifacts, which is a minimal problem in my opinion because decks love them. People have their soul rings, their mana crypts, they have their equipments. People love their artifacts. So, is it a downside that it only targets artifacts? Yes, technically, but it's a minimal downside in my opinion. Now, let's talk about green, the thing we've been talking a lot about this whole video. Autumn's Veil. Instant, spells you control can't be countered by blue or black spells this turn, and creatures you control can't be the targets of blue or black spells this turn. What makes this good? There's a lot of black removal, there's a lot of blue counters, and the fact that you get rid of essentially 2 of the biggest of the pie in terms of interaction is big. Of course, if you have the extra cash for it, get a Veil of Summer. It's strictly better Autumn's Veil. But for those of us who aren't rich, Autumn's Veil is pretty good. This could protect your spells for the turn. This could protect your creatures for the turn. It's an instant, so it's good on both your turn and your opponent's turn. If they decide to kind of, play an instant or sorcery like Fatal Push, for example, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, you can keep them from targeting it, which is pretty good. Again, one of the biggest downsides about most of the cards on this list is that they target. This is a card that keeps them from doing that to your stuff when it comes to Dimir color. And then another thing is that people are running a lot of Dimir nowadays. People are running a lot of what's the word for it? Eurigos. They're running a lot of Aminatus and Kesses, and they have a lot of those colors their decks. So the fact that you get to shut down half or more of their deck potentially from interacting with you is extremely important. And then, of course, like I mentioned earlier, you have Simic players. Half their deck is blues sometimes. You're keeping them from being able to do stuff to you. So, all in all, it's a really good card. Of course, the downside being it's not a Veil of Summer, but the upside being. Oh, and another downside actually being that if they're running Lightning Bolt or Galvanic Blast, you're still getting targeted. Moving on. Now let's talk about Nature's Claim. This card is a powerhouse. There are competitive decks that still run this card. A lot of them. because it's so good. Let's talk about why it's good. Destroy target artifact or enchantment. So immediately it's better than something like so immediately it's better than something such as a Vandal Blast that you cast for 1, right? It's immediately more versatile, and yeah, the downside is they gain 4 life. What's 4 life to something that's going to give them a game? You know what I mean? Like, I would much rather my opponent has 4 extra life than a Mycosynth Planet. Or what's another good artifact card? There's a million of them. Soul Rings, Mana Crypts, Jeweled Lotuses. You know what I mean? There's so many artifacts that this can target, and then the fact that it can also target enchantments. So it targets people's Sylvan's libraries. It targets their Underworld breaches at instant speed. I don't know about you, but I think every green deck needs this card because there are very few times where this is bad to cast. Of course, you would want it to counter or to destroy creatures too. Maybe, lands, maybe, planeswalkers. But the fact that it can shut down a good amount of win conditions with for just 1 and 4 life, I think it's worth it. I don't know about you, Chief. Unless your opponent's running like mono white life gain, there's no reason that you shouldn't play it. Now, last but not least, let's talk about fight. I know in the last video some people were really disappointed that there was only 1 white card. Well, in this one there's a few more that we want to talk about because there are a lot of good 1 cast, 1 drop white cards at instant and sorcery speed. For instance, Angel's Grace. Split second, which means nobody can interact once you cast this. That's it for the stack. It must resolve now. You can't lose the game this turn. Your opponents cannot win the game this turn. Until end of turn, damage that would reduce your life total to less than 1 reduces it to 1 instead. Let's think about what this card has to offer. If your opponent is playing something like Self-Mill and they're winning through a Thassa's Oracle, you just stop. And they now have no deck. So they're going to lose on their next draw step. Unless they can do something about it. If your opponents are running things like big green stompy dinosaurs and they want to hit you for 37 damage, well, now they can hit you for as much damage as they want. You're not going anywhere, Chief. And the fact that some of your opponents can mill you out, things like that, force you to draw, you are keeping yourself around because a lot of those mill strategies end up milling themselves too. So you may be able to win on their next draw step. It just depends, right? This card is really versatile. It's not as good as some of the other cards, but it's definitely a secret tech that some decks use to keep themselves in the game for 1 more turn, which may be that 1 more turn is what they need. Moving on to Fragmentize. Sorcery, destroy target artifact or enchantment with 4 mana value or less. It's essentially like a Nature's Claim, except it's mana value restricted in that it has to be 4 mana value or less. There are a lot of good artifacts and enchantments that are 4 mana value or less. And that's something that you really want to think about, right? Is your pod running those scary artifacts and enchantments that you don't like to see? Are they running Underworld breach lines? Are they running good artifacts? Which most decks are. Most decks are running great artifacts. Being able to spot remove an artifact, I mean, of course it's sorcery speed, so it's not as good. But being able to do that can really keep you in the game. I mean, there's not much else to say about it. The downside being that it has to be 4 mana value or less. So if they play, Mycos Atlantis, Caged Sun, things like that, then you can't really do anything about that with this card. But I mean, it's still very useful. It's really good in the early game, mid game. Maybe not so much in the late game, but that really depends on your opponent's decks. So 2 cards that are extremely similar to one another are Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshare. Let's unpack what they do. Instant speed, 1 drop. Exile target creature. Its controller may search the library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, tapped, and shuffle. That's path to exile. Swords to Plowshares says they gain life. Swords to Plowshares says that they gain life equal to its power. In my opinion, Swords to Plowshares is a little bit better because I would much rather my opponent have life than an extra land. Both cards are extremely good at removing things. They exile the creature, so if they're running something like Magistrate, or if they're running something like Dockside, and you exile them, they really have no way of getting it back. And that could potentially stop their win. It could potentially speed you up, and it could keep them from being able to lock you down. And that's really important. Some of the secret tech that I've personally used with Path to Exile specifically is I've exiled my own creature token so I could get an extra land. Difficult times. But that being said, it's really good. They're both really good cards, and I think people should really consider playing them. They're a little bit more on the higher value when it comes to this list. I think Swords to Plowshares currently sitting at like $4, and same thing with Path. I think Path is actually running closer to 5. But I think every white deck needs these cards. Just being able to interact with people's board states, being able to potentially exile huge threats, that's extremely important, and that keeps white in the game potentially, especially mono white deck. So that's something to think about. Now, last but not least, Silence. This card is stupid good. It is so good because it is a 1-drop, instant speed. Your opponents cannot cast spells this turn. Well, Brandon, why is it good? Because it protects you on your turn. You could cast it at your upkeep before you draw, and your opponents really aren't going to be able to do much unless they're trying to board wipe you at instant speed, which is rare. It could stop your opponents if you know that they have a win in hand. So if they casted like 3 tutors on their last turn, and you're like, well, I need to keep them from winning, cast Silence. What are you going to do now, Chief? Not a thing. That's the answer. This deck is, or excuse me, this card is super duper important. Every single white deck needs this card. I say that, and I mean that. Because every time I've casted this card, I've won the game. Every single... I want you all to understand, I played a lot of Commander over the years. And I've played this card for most of that time. And every single time I've casted it, it has won me the game. Now, are you going to have that same kind of luck? Probably not. But is it going to help you stop your opponents? Yes. Is it going to help you secure your win? Absolutely. Is it going to help you do anything else you might need to do on that turn? Probably not. I mean, it only stops other people doing things. It doesn't really enhance what you're doing. But that being said, this card is super, super, super good, and I highly suggest you pick one up before they climb back up to $15 a pop. That's really all I've got to say about this. Thank you so much for joining. If you like what we do, please join the Discord or support us on Patreon. Links are in the description below. Please let us know what cards you'd like to see in the comments. Let us know what we missed, what you think might be some spicy tech of 1 mana value. And let us know what cards you might want to see in the future, as we are also going to do a 2 mana value. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye!